Okay, folks, so we're going to talk about DIY gimbals for DIY Steadicams. It's probably arguably one of the two most complicated things about a Steadicam is the gimbal, and the other is balance and center of gravity and getting all that right, getting your weighting right. So I haven't figured that out completely. However, there's some things I've learned not to do, and I'll explain that towards the end of the video. For the DIY gimbal, you're going to need a Traxxas U-joint. A lot of hobby stores carry these. This one is a 6850X. It's a fairly heavy-duty U-joint. I like it except for one thing. It doesn't bend at a 90-degree angle. And you're saying, well, I'm watching it bend at a 90-degree. Well, almost. I actually had to route out that center area down in there to make this thing work, to make it have a lot more range of motion. Had to use a router with a little tiny bit and shave away some of the nylon. The other thing about Traxxas U-joints is that they're fairly long. They actually come up to about here, so you're going to have to cut it down, and then you have to shave this down so it'll actually fit inside the middle of the skateboard bearing. So, let's talk about skateboard bearings. These I bought at a local skate shop. They cost me $4 for both of them. I would ask if they have any loose ones, you know, hey, that you can just have, or that you can pay them like a couple bucks for it, which is kind of nice. This is not the usual piece of PVC that people use. This is a 1/2-inch coupling, Schedule 40, and it works very well because it's a little bit thicker than regular PVC, so it's got a nice, you know, firm stability to it. The way I got the bearing inside of there is I sanded out, I actually routed out the inside of the PVC. Once the bearing will actually kind of sit in there with, you know, like maybe 1/8 of the way down, not very far. I mean, it just needs to be able to sit and be stable and be just below the lip. That's all it needs, not much. Once I had it to that point, I put canola oil on the inside of the pipe and on the outside of the bearing. And then I hit it with a heat gun from this angle, just like this, just going straight down into it. The heat gun is better than the oven, in my experience. One of the reasons for this is when you put this piece in the oven, first of all, it doesn't really get soft enough in some respects, but in other ways it gets too soft. When I first tried doing this, I tried doing it like somebody else had and put it in the oven and then put it in a vise and use the vise to pinch the whole thing together and pinch the bearing in there. That did not work. This the whole thing ended up being so soft it actually crushed like a pop can and the bearing never went in. So that was a big bummer. It may not do that if you shave out the inside with a little bit of sandpaper, you know, to kind of create a little bit more space. So what I did was instead I used a heat gun. The heat gun just softens up the top half of the PVC, and the bottom half stays cold and provides support. So it stays stiff and rigid. So I put that down like so. Once it was nice and heated up with a heat gun, which only takes 20 or 30 seconds, it will melt this stuff in a real hurry. I put the bearing in there, and I tapped it with a rubber mallet, and it popped right in there. Let it cool. It cools nice and firm. I don't know if you can see the actual physical deforming. It actually does flare out a little bit at this end, but that sucker's in there. It's not going anywhere, so that's kind of nice. Did the same thing over here with this joint. I actually got a little carried away with the heat gun, and I think I just started to melt it. But I basically did the same thing. This other joint is a little bit different. I put the bearing in the exact same way again, routed it out a little bit with the sandpaper, put the bearing in there after I'd oiled it, and then just tapped it. This one ended up being really soft, so actually the bearing went in really easy. But again, with all the in and out of this U-joint, you know, popping it in, pulling it out to check things, neither of my bearings has loosened up at all. The plastic is almost literally molded around it, so they're very firm. We used this particular bearing PVC pipe that you can see basically because of the style of Steadicam we were building. It didn't work out very well. I think this will still work. If you're looking at the screw in there, that bolt, if you were to look through that hole right in there, you would actually see that it's a Phillips head. and the Phillips head bolt runs through here, but it's running through a washer on the inside so that it doesn't come out. It's kind of hard to see, but there's a washer in there that keeps the screw from coming out. So what you do is you just pull out this guy right here, the U-joint, put the screwdriver in there, hold it, and then you can thread a bolt on the end here pretty easily. That's just one way we did it. Some notes about the Steadicam. This was my original design. We were going to use a piece of aluminum. We actually did end up using this piece of aluminum. It was a bad idea. The aluminum is extremely springy, and so the whole thing just kind of flexed and bounced underneath all the weight. Because I'm using a DSLR camera, actually that DSLR camera, it was just too much weight. It's about 2 pounds, and it's just too much weight for the aluminum. I'm going to be using conduit next time. I can tell you, though, the biggest problem and the biggest mistake that we made was we used a piece of tripod, the top part of a piece of tripod, thinking that would be easier, and then we mounted the handle directly beneath it. Do not, unless somebody can show me otherwise, and I'm not a physics or a math guy, but do not mount your handle directly beneath your camera. Your camera needs to sit back more, and your handle needs to sit forward more. WSC Later and Slambo 239 on YouTube have some fantastic demos, and you'll notice that both of their handles are further forward and their cameras are further back. Doing it this way proved to be a nightmare. When we actually had the ability to weight each of these sections while we were standing in Home Depot last night, we had boxes and boxes and boxes of any size washer we wanted, and we could not trim that thing out. It was a nightmare, and we were there for a good hour just trying to trim it out. It was just a disaster. So, that being said, it works much better, and if you watch Slambo's video, which looks like that right there, if you watch his video, he explains how this is basically a teeter-totter with weight on this side and weight on this side, and here's your center of gravity right there. And that's just something we didn't understand, and Slambo's probably the only guy that really understands, I think, or I should say he's the only one who really explains how this all works. So put your camera further back, put your handle further forward, and like WSC Later, the fine Scotsman, make sure your camera can slide. His camera can slide, and so he gets a nice changeable center of gravity so he doesn't run into some of the problems we ran into. So that's all I can say for the moment. Our next part of the project is probably going to look a little bit something like this with conduit. If we're just using conduit hangers and these can slide, I'm probably going to lengthen this out. I'm going to put my camera up here most likely on this unit. I can take this bottom plate off and then bolt the camera up, put a slot in the top there. So that's kind of where we're at right now. This video is getting way too long, but I wanted to explain. Here's how you make the gimbal with the Traxxas U-joint, a couple of skate bearings, and some PVC pipe. Again, just a screw running through there. There's a washer on the screw that keeps it from falling out. You can put your screwdriver up through the center of that hole to hold the screw steady, so that you can tighten down the bolt. It actually goes onto a conduit hanger like that fairly easily, not a big deal. It also mounts onto a lot of other things too. So, and then there's our Traxxas U-joint. And so hopefully I've just saved you a little bit of headache and heartache on how to deal with a DIY Steadicam. This is not proven. Don't run with this design. Look at somebody else's design. I'm still testing this and working with it. What I can tell you is don't use aluminum, and don't put your handle right underneath your camera, or else you're going to have an absolute nightmare of a time trying to balance it. One way to think of why that is so is try to imagine balancing yourself right at the fulcrum of a seesaw or a teeter-totter. Think about standing there and then trying to balance it perfectly. It's very difficult. But if you and another person, even if you're different weights, stand on either side of the fulcrum, one of you can walk in and one of you can walk out, and you can actually trim it out pretty stable, and it's not going to move that much. But when that weight's right over a universal joint, forget it. It is a freaking nightmare. So don't do that. Don't do that. So I'm going to get this probably all put together, and then I'm going to go down to Home Depot, stand there with my camera rig, and try to balance it out with the bolts they have on hand. I'll figure out what I need, and then I'll buy it and walk out with a perfectly balanced rig. That's the plan anyway. So anyway, hope this helped somebody, and hope it made sense. Let me know if you have questions or comments, and don't forget to check out Slambo 239 and WSC Later. Those two guys are pioneers and just stand-up guys who made some great videos on how to do this the right way. Thanks for watching. Okay, folks, so we're going to talk about DIY gimbals for DIY Steadicams. It's probably, arguably, one of the two most complicated things about a Steadicam is the gimbal with a nylon. The other thing about Traxxas U-joints is that they're fairly long. They actually come up to about here, so you're going to have to cut it down, and then you have to shave this down so it'll actually fit inside the middle of the skateboard bearing. You're going to need a Traxxas U-joint. A lot of hobby stores carry these. This one is a 6850X. It's a fairly heavy-duty U-joint. I like it except for one thing. It doesn't bend at a 90-degree angle. And you're saying, well, I'm watching it bend at a 90 degree. Well, almost. I actually had to route out that center area down in there to make this thing work, to make it have a lot more range of motion. Had to use a router with a little tiny bit and shave away some. And the other is balance and center of gravity and getting all that right, getting your weighting right. So I haven't figured that out completely. However, there's some things I've learned not to do, and I'll explain that towards the end of the video. For the DIY gimbal,